Well, come tomorrow, the Parliament will discuss the constitutional amendments that are necessary to facilitate the landmark goods and services tax. CNBC TV 18 has been on top of all the crucial developments. So here's the big news break at this hour. Next year's budget will have a broad estimate on the GST compensation. 20% is considered to be the politically acceptable rate, and at 20% the centre will have to shell out about 60,000 crore rupees to states in compensation. Sapna Das, who is breaking this story, joins us now with the details. Also with us, our colleague Rituparna Bhuyan, who's been sizing up the political reactions through the day in Parliament, and joins us now with the details of the clauses that will be amended as part of the GST Constitutional Amendment Bill. Sapna, let me come to you first. Take us through what we can now expect as far as the compensation itself is concerned come next budget.
Well, what we understand is the fact that some estimates may be provided in the next budget as far as the GST compensation is concerned. But these estimates will be very broad. There may not be a very exact number. Officials are also indicating that the actual revenue loss will only be known after the first year of operation of GST. Having said that, this much is pretty clear that probably a separate law for GST compensation may not be required, and the finance bill may be enough in terms of providing that first year number. Well, we do know that the Constitution has enabled a full 5-year compensation to states in case there is a revenue loss arising out of the GST rollout. Also, April 1, 2017 is the timeline that the government is looking at as of now in terms of the rollout. Well, the compensation formula will also be there, and that is something that is likely to be decided by the GST Council. As of now, the indications are that if the GST rate settles around the 18% levels, the first year revenue loss may not be more than 30,000 crores. But the states, on the other hand, are indicating that if the GST rate settles at a different band, probably around the 20% level, well, a compensation of up to 60,000 crores may be required.
All right, so that's the fiscal math as far as the GST is concerned. But Ritu, coming to you now, the one thing that the government doesn't really need to care about, so it seems at this point in time, is the Rajya Sabha math, because most political parties say that they will support the landmark legislation. But take us through the amendments that the government proposes to move tomorrow.
Before I take you through the amendments, Shireen, it will be a long day tomorrow. Some of the Rajya Sabha MPs told me that the discussions could go well, beyond 10 o'clock tomorrow. 10 o'clock in the night, so clearly it will be a long day tomorrow, but the government is going to move at least 6 amendments. One of the amendments is regarding the dispute settlement mechanism. 3 mechanisms will be proposed by the government. First will be basically between disputes between the centre and the states. That will be the first mechanism which the GST Council will set up. The second will be between centre and state, some states on one side versus other states. So that will be the second mechanism. And the third mechanism is, of course, between states and other states, states versus states. Also, we understand that that there will be an amendment which will ensure that the funds and levies collected by states do not end up in the Consolidated Fund of India. This was a major demand which the states had discussed with the centre in the recent state FM's meeting. So that has been accepted, and the state levies will not end up in the Consolidated Fund of India. That is again one amendment which the government is going to move. Also, there will be a mechanism which will basically specify in clear terms on how levies collected by the centre will be divided between the centre and the states. And of course, last but not the least, there will also be a more clear wording regarding how the states will be compensated. We understand that there are some problems regarding that. Some political parties have asked for a more clear, stringent and more clear norms regarding that, and perhaps Finance Minister Arun Jaitley will be announcing a change in that clause, which is basically clause number 19. Last but not the least, clause 18, which is related to 1% extra tax, that has been done away with. I spoke to several political parties regarding what they feel about tomorrow's constitutional amendment bill and how they see it, and this is what they had to say regarding tomorrow's constitutional amendment bill, which will be taken up by the Rajya Sabha.
Now there is agreement on the abolition of surcharge. Also in the Constitution Amendment Bill, clearly it will be reflected that a dispute redressal mechanism shall be established. Now the third issue is about the rate cap. We have called for legal ring fencing so that it is not left to any change by the executive arbitrage. But that has to be reflected in the law. Neither the centre nor the states, or for that matter the GST Council as we would call it, is ready with the bill, because there is no consensus so far on what should be the rate and how the slabs will work out.
हमारे राज्यसभा के लीडर और डिप्टी लीडर और दूसरे नेता भी बातचीत किए हैं और आज हमारी पार्टी की बैठक भी हो गई जिसमें राज्यसभा के मेंबर और लोकसभा के मेंबर थे। कांग्रेस प्रेसिडेंट आने के बाद इसमें कल निर्णय हो जाएगा और उसके बाद सारी चीजें ठीक ठाक हो जाएगी।
हमें उम्मीद ये है कि राज्यसभा में पारित हो जाएगा और उसके बाद में फिर आगे की सारी बातों की चर्चा राज्यसभा में जो सांसद लोग करेंगे उससे फिर आगे की एक तय करने की रणनीति तय करने की बात हम सबकी समझ में आएगी।
जीएसटी देश के हित में है, ये सबके लिए विन विन है और भारत के आर्थिक विकास के लिए बहुत ही आवश्यक है। तो ये आम सहमति के साथ कल जीएसटी राज्यसभा में लिस्टेड है। हम उम्मीद करते हैं ये सर्वसम्मति से पारित होगा।
Well, so the political reactions, they're coming in thick and fast, at least as far as the Rajya Sabha arithmetic is concerned. It doesn't seem to be too much of a concern now for the government, with most parties coming out to support the GST constitutional amendment bill. But for the benefit of our viewers, and I've been stressing on this and I'm going to point this out again, the constitutional amendment bill is the first step. It's only facilitating the advent of the GST. The contentious issues around rates, will it be 18%, 20%, what happens to branded garments, all of that is going to be dealt with later when the GST bill will be taken up, and that is expected in the winter session. So tomorrow, don't expect any fireworks. The fine print, the nitty-gritties of the constitutional amendment bill is not really stuff that you and me are going to be too concerned about. It's stuff that our panel here is going to be concerned with. Joining us now to discuss this further, Asif Drabu, the Finance Minister of Jammu and Kashmir, Satya Poddar, partner at EY, and Naushad Forbes, the President of the Confederation of Indian Industry. Gentlemen, appreciate you joining us here on the show. Mr. Drabu, let me start by asking you, because the Constitutional Amendment Bill, the draft, has now been put forward by the government, and it looks like there are about 6 to 7 key amendments that the government proposes to move. Let me start by asking you about whether you are satisfied on what the government has said with respect to the amendments to the Consolidated Fund of India to ensure that state levies or the IGST monies will not go into the Consolidated Fund of India.
Let me start by first saying that, as I've already said in the Empowered Committee, that in its present form, GST bill, the amendments will not be applicable to J&K. So that's one specific case, because we have our own constitution and we have our own constitution power of tax services. We are the only state in the country that has a levy on tax on services. So it will not apply to us. But having said that, for J&K, I think as a part of the Empowered Committee of Finance Ministers, broadly, yes, the technical issue of money getting into Consolidated Fund and how it would be moved out of the Consolidated Fund across so many states has been resolved to the satisfaction of what was discussed in the Empowered Committee. From what I can make out, basically two concerns still remain. One was the language on compensation. There were two issues. One was that initially the draft had suggested that the Parliament may by law, may, which was transformed to shall, and I think that has been accepted. But the word full compensation for 5 years, the word full has not been incorporated. So I think there is some concern which I'm sure the Union Finance Minister would clarify tomorrow while kind of moving the amendments. That is one kind of concern area which all states had shared, that it must be given a definitive thing that it's full, subject to a criteria for compensation, which will come in not as a part of the amendment, but as a part of the law and so on and so forth. Second part relates to the amendment on Article 270, I think, Clause 1 and 1A and 1B, which refers to the IGST unclaimed credits not being a part of the divisible pool. I think that also needs some clarification for the states to be fully on board for this, and this was discussed both in the Empowered Committee as well as the Select Committee of Rajya Sabha had recommended that the unclaimed credits on IGST should form a part of the divisible pool states, which doesn't seem to have been made. But the other parts, in terms of, as you were saying, that which is correct, that in terms of the language of the constitutional amendments, the generics are fine. This is what was discussed in the Empowered Committee, and I would imagine should not be a problem for any states in terms of accepting the broad language of the constitutional amendments. And whatever was agreed to in the Empowered Committee discussions and negotiations was done in good faith, and I think that part has been honored.
You're absolutely right on that front. In fact, we are given to understand that the Finance Minister has in fact reached out to two parties today on the issue of the compensation clause, and perhaps we will see a further amendment on that. The language perhaps will be tweaked even further to say that there will be full compensation, not up to 5 years, but for a period of 5 years, which is what state governments have been asking for. Satya Poddar, we're pretty much at the climax, at least as far as the GST Constitutional Amendment Bill is concerned. There's plenty of work that we need to get done before the GST in fact can roll out. But on the back of what you've seen today of the likely amendments, the proposed amendments, especially to do with the dispute resolution mechanism that has been proposed, are you satisfied? And do you believe states will be as well?
First of all, the Constitution plays a very delicate balancing role between the autonomy of the individual states and the need for harmonization. So what has happened is that under the Constitution, the GST Council recommendations are not binding. They're only recommendations. And the states are free to choose to adopt or reject those recommendations. So the question arises is that if the states deviate from the GST Council recommendations, what should be the mechanism for bringing them back to the common harmonized framework that the GST Council is recommending? Now, the constitutional amendment simply states that there will be a mechanism for dispute resolution, or there shall be one, but we still don't know how the disputes will be resolved. What will be the consequences for those states which deviate from the GST Council recommendations? And until and I doubt that the dispute resolution mechanism will have the power to punish the states which choose to deviate from the GST Council recommendations. So I think there's not much we can do about it. It's largely based on fear of the states that if they have to give up their fiscal autonomy, what are the consequences and how much fiscal autonomy they will have. And the dispute resolution mechanism is in a way the constraint on the fiscal autonomy they are going to exercise. So let's hope.
Yes,
the good news is that all of those discussions are largely horse trading between the center and the states, and they don't have an iota of impact on the economy. Impact on the economy will depend entirely on the design of the GST and to what extent that design is good for the economy and the GST compliance procedures are simplifying.
You're absolutely right. I'll come back to you, Mr. Poddar, in just a second. Let me bring in Naushad Forbes, president of the CII. Mr. Forbes, you've spoken to us several times about the GST and the implications of the GST rollout and what it could mean for the economy. But let me try and ask you about rates. Even though rates are not going to be addressed in the Constitutional Amendment Bill, will industry live with 18%? Or, as is now being suggested, that states are more in favor of anything between 20 to 22%. What would be the perspective as far as corporate India is concerned on the likely GST rate, which will be addressed later?
So, what we've been saying is that the Arvind Subramaniam Committee report, as you know, has proposed a rate of between 16 and 18%. That's a rate that we can live with in industry. We believe that that is a workable rate which will not be inflationary, that will not lead to price increases, and that it is indeed, I think it was calculated by the committee as a revenue neutral rate. That's the right way of going about setting the initial rate, such that it is revenue neutral, and we end up with the benefits of an easier and more transparent and less cascading tax system, and not really a tax system which either raises or reduces the rate of tax that's paid.
Well, you know, since we're talking about rates, and Mr. Drabu, let me ask you this, because while this wasn't specifically discussed at the State Empowered Finance Ministers panel, at least that is our understanding, we believe that there were some sort of guiding principles that the Empowered panel arrived at to determine the rate going forward. Now, the centre continues to bat for 18%, which is as per the Subramaniam panel's recommendations, but we are given to understand that states find anything between 20 to 22% the more acceptable rate. Can you take us through where things stand at the State Empowered Panel's meeting on rates, sir?
See, broadly, if you were to look at it, what the situation today is that we are operating in a regime broadly between 27 and 29% as is various basis, with all the central and the state levies together. Of course, there are interstate variations, but I'm saying broadly the number is at 27, 28, 29%. What the Empowered Committee did discuss in the guiding principles you're referring to, that the Empowered Committee in principle agreed to a substantial reduction in the tax rate, which is consistent with lower inflation and also protects the level and the buoyancy of the current revenues of the central and state government. So now these numbers that you're throwing up in 20%, 22% are all numbers, you know, which everybody can speculate on. But as a matter of principle, there is a consensus in the states that we would look at a substantial reduction in the tax rate, which would be consistent, of course, which reduce the incidence of tax on the common man and is consistent with a certain level of inflation. So that is the broad principle. Now, what substantial reduction means will evolve over time, and I think that's what one of the contentious issues would be in terms of trying to put a thing. But when you talk constitutional amendments, I don't think there's need to put a rate in the constitutional amendment. This will all come as a part of the subsequent work that is that will be done by the GST Council and the states and the centre together. So significant reduction is what is the guiding principle that we are talking of. I also want to come in on this issue of dispute resolution mechanism, which Poda was talking about. It's not that the states can be punished, but broadly, and this is not that's been discussed in the Empowered Committee, but one can look at various options in terms of how to bring this, because the 14th Commission and the 13th Commission earlier, even the 9th Commission, had introduced a concept of conditional grants, that if you do certain fiscal changes and fiscal reforms, that certain amount of money will flow to you. Now, it could be linked to compensation, that if states move out of line, what is the way to get them back onto line is to link compensation to the behavior of the state. That if you are going against what the consensus is, then a certain conditional compensation is what can be worked out. It's also, I mean, obviously you can't anticipate the kind of disputes, the kind of issues that will come up. To that extent, it's a work in progress thing, and we do have 5 years to actually put this in a form where you will institutionalize the mechanism of dispute resolution, because one really doesn't know, because there are 3 sets of GSTs, the CGST, SGST, IGST, with each have its own kind of complications. How that will pan out across states, your producer states, consumer states, centre versus states, then the GST Council, where 66% weightage is for centre. So it's a little, right now it's a fairly complicated situation, and a lot of work will have to be done, a lot of skill has to be shown in getting this through on the ground.
Oh, yeah, absolutely right. As I said, the hard work only starts now, Mr. Drabu. But Mr. Poddar, let me come to you now. And I want to pick up on the point that, that Mr. Drabu made there about the resolution that's been adopted at the State Empowered Panel meeting, saying that a significant reduction in rates should be the guiding principle to arrive at the revenue neutral rate. We've seen what the Subramaniam panel has suggested. You know, the arithmetic that we're getting from the government seems to suggest that the revenue loss in FY18 could be about 30,000 crore rupees if the GST rate is 18%, and compensation to states could be at about 60,000 crore rupees with a GST rate at about 20%. How would you interpret the comments that have come in from Mr. Drabu on the significant reduction in rates, and also what would you anticipate as the compensatory amount as well as the impact in the first year of the GST rollout?
Well, the statement or the commitment being given by the states and the center, there will be significant reduction in the tax rates, to me is an empty statement. It doesn't really have any operational implications. The key guiding principle is that the tax should be revenue neutral. Now, broader the tax base, lower the tax rates. My experience in New Zealand and few other countries where I have been involved in the design of a GST type tax is that the lower the rate, more the revenue you get. In New Zealand, for an example, they brought in the GST at the rate of 10%. And in the very first year, the revenue projections were, the actual revenues turned out to be 42% higher than the revenues projected on the basis of revenue neutral rate calculations. And this is exactly what can happen in India. If you bring in the tax at a low rate on a broad basis with no exemptions or very few exemptions, you don't need the tax rate of 18%. Arvind Subramaniam went to great pains to illustrate how the tax revenue neutral rate need not be 18%. It can be as low as 13, 14, 15%. And at that rate, you have a very significant dividend coming from better compliance, improvement in the economy, and the larger GDP pie.
So where do you see this headed, Mr. Poddar? Because again, the sense that we got, and I'll get Mr. Drabu to correct me, is that the Empowered Panel didn't really seem to agree very much with the recommendations of the Subramaniam panel.
Yes, that's very true. All the indications that we have had from the Empowered Committee finance ministers are saying that they want something in the range of 20–22%. I'm saying good luck. You can impose the tax at any rate you want, but if you want more revenues, the secret is not to jump the tax rates to 20–25%, but to lower them below 15%.
Okay, Mr. Drabu, I want to quickly get you. Sure. I get your point, Mr. Poddar. Mr. Drabu, is it true that the Empowered Panel of State Finance Ministers don't really seem to agree very much with the recommendations of the Arvind Subramaniam Committee on the GST, and respond to the point that Mr. Poddar was making there, that a significant reduction would actually mean a rate lower than 18%? Is that likely to be palatable for state governments?
See, as an economic logic or intellectual argument, I, as a finance minister, don't have the liberty and luxury of either Mr. Poddar or Mr. Subramaniam. The fact of the matter is that Mr. Subramaniam, a good friend of mine, a fellow economist, can say this, and Mr. Poddar can also make these statements that lower tax regimes help better compliance. There's no dispute on that. Fact of the matter is that when you're running the state government, you have to realize that our resources, as it is, are fairly limited in the constitution. And post the 14th Commission Award also, though there's been some increase in the revenues, and there's a greater automatic nature to revenue flows, the fact is that we don't have the most buoyant source of revenue in the state governments. So we have to manage our expenses. And for that, there is need. Now, compensation is based on a realistic basis, right? That what will eventually flow. So in year one, we'll get a sense of it. It is good to have these take comfort from these economic logic. Exemptions, for instance, is very easy to say. But when you run a state like J&K, where the entire industry is driven only by exemptions, or the Northeast for that matter, it will be very difficult to even abolish one exemption. We'll have to work out a modality of how to kind of make our industry competitive. India is not one state. It's a conglomeration of states at different levels of development. As I said, Northeast, J&K are states which you think about. So it's easier said than done. I don't dispute the theoretical logic behind this, but when it comes to practical reasoning, we'll have to see the structure of the GDP, the level of growth, the taxation is, and so on, and on that basis. So year one will be our first year when we'll figure out what the revenues are looking like, how buoyant they are, based on what structure of GDP, what growth, what compliance, plus of course the operational issues like turnover of 1.5 crore, below that, who handles it, above that, who handles it. All those things will now, when you start dirtying your hands with it in terms of tax administration, not tax theory, then these things become very important. We also I don't think collectively states have a great deal of comfort from the way center has been compensating in the last 60 years, even on CST issues. There are still pendencies of last 5 years or 7 years on compensation. So a whole lot of discomfort comes from that factor.
It's going to be a serious balancing act between what will work in practice and what will work in theory, and of course the politics of it all. But Mr. Forbes, let me ask you, anything more than 18%, closer to 20 to 22%, is corporate India prepared?
So I think if it goes up to 20%, even that is probably something that one could live with. If it goes anything beyond 20%, then I think it starts becoming much more problematic. And I believe the proposal now is to ring fence the rate, not to include a rate cap in the constitutional amendment bill itself, but instead to ring fence the rate, maybe at around 18 or 20% in the bill, as opposed to in the constitution. And we think that's a good step forward, because it will provide some certainty to industry going forward that this is the rate they can expect in the longer term.
Well, that ring fencing is something that the Congress has been asking for, but of course, again, I'm pointing out, rates not going to be mentioned in the Constitutional Amendment Bill tomorrow. It will be dealt with on a later date. Hasib Drabu, Satyapodar, Noshad Forbes, appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV 18 as we count down to the GST Constitutional Amendment Bill being taken up and passed by the Rajya Sabha. It promises to be an exciting and a long day tomorrow, so stay tuned.